My name is Michael Kelly. I'm the Policy Director for Bikewalk KC, and I'm here to talk to you tonight about the basics of working with staff and elected officials. This is Advocacy Training 104 from Bikewalk KC. Again, I am Michael Kelly. I'm the Policy Director, and our mission at Bikewalk KC is to redefine our streets as places for people, build a culture of active living. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn at Bikewalk KC. So in terms of what we're going to be talking about tonight, we're going to begin with kind of the raison d'etre, why electeds and staff, before diving a little bit more into the fundamentals of how they work, both on the structural side and on the dynamic side. And we will finish our presentation tonight by talking a little bit more about how you can begin to use your understanding of the structure and dynamics to begin cultivating a relationship with your elected officials and city staff. But first, we need to ask the question, why electeds and staff? And the answer, in short, is that adoption of policies, plans, and projects is only the first step, not the last. So while we often tend to focus on the people who vote for or against something, the truth is that this is only part of how the community works, especially when it comes to issues relating to walking, biking, accessibility, and transit. It often takes a combination of work from both elected officials and staff at City Hall for something to happen. Electeds and staff are, like all of us, human. It is inevitable that mistakes will occur. This is compounded by the fact that they work in human institutions, which also create plenty of opportunities for error. Just like many advocates are working to create a transportation system which accounts for these errors and works to forgive those errors, so too must we work with staff and electeds to make changes to the operational system, which must create and maintain those changes. We must also remember that being an elected official and a staff member to a greater extent is often a thankless job. The first time a lot of folks interact with either of them is when they feel the need to voice frustration about something which isn't working. Especially on the staff side, people don't tend to do this work for power, fame, or money. They do this work because they want to make a positive impact in the community. With limited resources and sometimes fraught leadership, electeds and staff more often than not are trying to do the best they can with the cards they've been dealt. So take a look at the sidewalk, common sight to see with cracks and desperately in need of repair. So a common and necessary response as a resident is to call 311 and to tell someone at City Hall that the sidewalk is cracked and needs to be repaired. When you make that request, a number of folks and factors have to come together. The water department and utilities must look to see if the repairs beneath the sidewalk, which need to be replaced. Planning and public works may need to consult existing plans or documents to ensure that the sidewalk is on the appropriate list and that they have the budget to fix it this year. City leaders may want to observe the work done to inform you as a constituent that the repairs have been made and consider how the process could be improved next time. Understanding how some of these elements under human circumstances work alongside one another is what we'll largely be discussing tonight. As advocates, it's important to push for changes to move from the paper to the pavement. What makes that push more effective is understanding how elected officials and staff must work together to complete that move as well. Having a better understanding of the structure and dynamics at play between those two groups in your community helps you to identify better places to push for change and give you key insights to strengthen your arguments for those changes. Let's get into it. So to begin, let's start by understanding the structure. And what we mean by this is how our electeds and staff are required to function. So in general, when we speak about working with elected officials, it's important to understand the structure of how each group works on their own and in conjunction with the other. Keep in mind that these explanations within the context are within the context of active transportation, and that I'm focusing primarily on the local level. So first, to create a community which supports multimodal transportation throughout, there has to be an idea of what that support looks like. Elected officials are largely responsible for creating that idea and making it official guidance for the city to follow. In working to set the tone and vision for active transportation in a community, elected officials will usually rely on some combination of policies, plans, or projects to make that vision clearer for themselves, for staff, and for the people who elected them to their positions. Staff and advocates in different ways help to inform electeds of what policies, plans, and projects are needed, and to varying degrees, what they should include. So once the vision has been set by elected staff, then work to make that vision a reality. Staff work to understand the policies, plans, and projects in greater detail so they can then determine how to take that vision from the paper to the pavement. Within the active transportation space, that can look like a number of different activities. This includes developing more detailed policies, creating internal guidance for staff to follow, pursuing grants to pay for certain improvements, and working to build and or maintain new or existing infrastructure for people to walk, roll, or bike upon. Elected officials and advocates often support these efforts by finding ways to inform and respond to these details as they are developed and come into focus. Because all of this work involves unwinding from a decades-long car-centric approach to transportation, new challenges arise frequently. Communication is key to ensure that left foot and right foot are walking in the right direction. That's why it is, or at least should be common, to see presentations, public meetings, audits, and more to figure out what's working and what needs to be modified to continue making progress towards that vision of a truly multimodal transportation system. So understanding the structure on the elected side of things tends to center more on how they formally consider and vote on given legislation. Consider the following. In many, though not all places, elected officials have a legislative aide who helps them with their official duties. This can include everything from setting meetings to researching prospective legislation, and this often means that aides are some of the key people who shape and inform an elected stance on a given piece of legislation. Understanding who an elected's legislative aide is and how they operate can be very beneficial to understanding how the legislator operates as well. Most legislation isn't a one and done affair when it comes to voting. In KCMO, for example, legislation must be voted on by a committee before it goes to the full council for a final vote. Those committees are made up of smaller groups of the full council and are organized around sometimes fuzzy borders of policy areas, which means that proposed legislation isn't always predisposed to go to a certain committee. And finally, the big question is how many electeds need to support a proposed policy, plan, or project in order for it to be adopted. Most communities have a pretty clear-cut number on this, but this isn't always the case. Some communities only allow the mayor to vote as a tiebreaker. Some specific votes require a supermajority of electeds to support it. The vast majority of transportation-related decisions before an elected body will usually require a simple majority, but it can be helpful to know when something more is necessary in the community in which you work. When looking at staff and trying to better understand how they operate, be sure you can answer the following questions. Who are the key staff? The key staff who typically work on transportation issues in a community are found within the planning or public works department. If it's a larger community, it may also be helpful to find out who handles sidewalk or bikeway coordination in the water and parks departments as well. What are their main duties? It's tempting to go straight to the public works director for your community to ask for a sidewalk repair, and some communities are small enough that such outreach makes sense. But it's helpful to take the time to find the right person who works on the issue you want to see addressed. Oftentimes, it is as easy as sending an email or making a phone call. Done correctly, this can help you to begin establishing a rapport with them. This can be helpful later on for understanding the dynamics at play between staff, departments, and between staff and electeds as well. What decisions do they get to make? This is an important aspect to consider. Elected officials aren't the only ones who make decisions about what does or doesn't happen with something related to the built environment. While these decisions can be small, there are times where they can make decisions which effectively save or kill a project, even if said project is something other staff and even electeds want to see move forward. The idea isn't to build frustration. but to know where else you need to push to get your ask over the finish line. And finally, what are the decisions based upon? Staff are often guided by a combination of direction from electeds and senior staff, as well as guidance from various policies and plans. We'll talk more about the dynamics between staff and electeds in a moment, but with regards to plans and policies, understanding the mandates assigned to staff can begin to inform how staff are approaching predetermined projects as well as requests from the general public. Beyond the people themselves, it's also important to understand the broader guardrails, or should I say flex posts, which govern those who govern. It's not as simple as knowing whether or not your community has a sidewalks plan or a complete streets policy, however. In understanding the structure and teaching yourself the text, you're working to understand what guides electeds and staff through the maze of bureaucracy to a decision on your issue. So first, electeds and staff must often work within predetermined schedules to make certain decisions related to certain projects and/or budgetary matters. This can be for numerous reasons, such as deadlines for submissions, community charter rules, or agreed upon timelines amongst staff and electeds. Knowing when these will be can be helpful as an advocate because they can help you to understand when may be a more effective time to apply pressure on your issue. Even if a deadline for that year has passed, it can still be helpful because it gives you more time to prepare to make the same push later on. Speaking of the budget, while it may seem daunting, understanding the budget can offer a clarifying look into the considerations electeds will weigh and how staff can respond. You don't have to know the budget back and forth. Simply knowing where to look on the issues you care about for transportation is often sufficient. Oftentimes, a budget will break down how much is spent on transportation and possibly a breakdown of spending within the transportation budget. Familiarize yourself with how much is spent on sidewalks and trails relative to road spending. Additionally, look at how much is budgeted for staff in a given department like planning or public works. If staff are saying they can't get something done, it's likely because they don't have enough staff, which creates an opportunity for a specific ask in later budget conversations. Finally, you have to understand what the rules are around outreach to electeds and staff. While this does include emails and phone numbers, it can also be helpful to understand if there is a designated email, contact form, or phone number for general inquiries as well. Some entities are very strict about how members of the public do outreach and will disregard messages received outside of their designated channels. While the ultimate goal is to build channels beyond this form of communication, you still need to understand the basics of what that outreach looks like. So with the understanding of structure out of the way, let's shift gears and talk a little bit more about observing the dynamics. How does staff and elected tend to work together? Equally important to the structure of how electeds and staff are supposed to work with one another is the dynamics of how electeds and staff actually work with one another. So the dynamics are an additional layer on top of how City Hall is organized to operate. This includes the undefined elements which don't inherently drive how decisions are made at City Hall, but likely influence what goes into the decisions being made. A good way to think about it is like siblings. The structural side of siblings are the clear-cut parts of the relationship, age differences, parental or familial bonds, and so on. The dynamic side of siblings are the less defined, but no less important parts of the relationship, rivalries and feuds, differences in upbringings, likes and dislikes. Knowing someone is related doesn't tell you the whole story. You have to also have the context on top of the structural aspect. So because this is something which isn't simply written down in a manual and often requires building and sustaining relationships with electeds and staff, it typically takes longer to understand the dynamics which are at play between staff and electeds. Going to public meetings and having one-on-one interactions can help to move this along, but it will almost certainly take more time to understand the dynamics between staff and electeds than it will to understand the structure. It's also important to note that this also varies between the different groups at play here. Dynamics among electeds will typically be the quickest to be understood. Dynamics between staff and electeds will take longer, and dynamics among staff will take the longest of all of these to understand. In trying to understand the dynamics, it's easy to get bogged down in viewpoints and stories which veer into gossip. Relying on gossip doesn't help you to understand the dynamic, and following it too closely can impede your broader advocacy efforts. If you're trying to discern between important dynamic insights and simple gossip, consider the two following guidelines. One, what is the level of detail you're hearing on the subject at hand? The more detail, the better. And two, is this something you're hearing from multiple folks? Keep this in mind and be prepared to address the issue if it is directly stopping you from achieving what you want. But be willing to set it aside if this isn't the case. The dynamics among electeds naturally center on how they interact with other electeds, but understanding additional aspects of how they approach their work should be taken into consideration as well. Like siblings, some electeds get along and some absolutely hate each other. As advocates, it behooves us to know which electeds get along and which ones clash, because understanding that dynamic can make it easier to figure out how to build lasting and effective coalitions when it comes to critical votes. On the implementation side, this is also important to understand if you're trying to get your community to build something or institute a program which covers multiple elected jurisdictions. So in Kansas City, for example, trying to get a transit corridor up and running between, say, the 5th and the 6th district will require working with multiple council members. How do they interact with other staff? Because staff tend to be career employees with institutional knowledge that sometimes gives them knowledge they can impart on elected officials. Depending on how this knowledge is imparted can sometimes play into the dynamic which forms between the elected and the staff. And finally, this is the most speculative aspect of elected dynamics, and you never really know this unless an elected official comes out and says it. The reason that the dynamics of higher office is important to at least keep in mind is because if an elected has made that choice, it will likely play into how they approach their work. They may become more willing to work with staff or electeds if they know they need to get something done, which they can campaign on later. But they may also become more cautious to avoid upsetting a key constituency. Knowing that if this is even a possibility can help you to understand which types of strategies or partners to lean on more in trying to get something done. As I mentioned earlier, staff dynamics are typically harder to understand because you don't interact with them as much. With that said, there are still parameters to consider as you try to understand those dynamics. This includes the following. First, being a bureaucrat is often more thankless than being an elected. Coupled with the fact that transportation itself is a dynamic field makes being a bureaucrat all the more challenging. It means being able to understand the changes in the philosophy over time. Bike lane is better than Shero, protected is better than paint alone, and balancing that with a range of philosophies among people who must build it and experience it. Understanding how people have been able to adapt to these changes or not can better inform how to craft your ask when the time comes. Departments have to work together, but that doesn't always mean that they get along. The reasons for this vary considerably, but it creates greater challenges than disagreements between staff. Where you may be able to avoid a council member to get the votes necessary to get something passed, you can't avoid an entire department to get a project completed. If there is tension or disagreement between departments, the key to getting things accomplished, besides influence from electeds, is to find common ground in the structure. What does the legislation say? How soon do they have to complete a project? Placing the ask you want completed within the context of something which has to be done and relying on precedent can help to limit tension enough to get something done. And finally, while there are policy and planning mandates which staff must follow, such mandates still create some room for picking and choosing how the mandate is accomplished. Within that realm, there can sometimes be divergence between what electeds want to see accomplished and what staff may want to see accomplished. Be it a pet project or a personal vendetta, staff have their own desires of what they want to see accomplished outside of what they're required to do. Understanding this dynamic, and more importantly, being able to align your ask with those desires, can help you to build a rapport with staff to help move those issues forward. So, with those ideas of structure and dynamic in mind, we can now focus our attention on how you can begin to use those elements to build relationships and cultivate a stronger rapport with staff and electeds. So, in working with staff and electeds based on structure and dynamics, it becomes easier to narrow your ask to something more specific. This doesn't mean that you must abandon everything else you want to accomplish. It simply means taking the small steps first, which will enable you to take the bigger steps later. The other aspect to keep in mind is this. Recall from earlier that staff and electeds often hear from people who are upset about something and simply want it fixed. If you're approaching them outside of this context with small but impactful asks, you are helping to establish yourself as an expert and someone who they will want to build a rapport with. As much as possible, present your ask as something grounded in something meaningful. The city's comprehensive plan calls for these policy changes, or the policy identifies this street as a target for a road diet, are examples of how you can couch your ask in the structure that electeds and staff have to follow. There's also the dynamic side to use as well. Based on previous discussions that we've had about this intersection, is another way you can lend legitimacy to your ask. In this way, you not only build a rapport, but you help to present your ask as reasonable, expected, and ultimately feasible. Play up support from friendly voices. So recall from dynamics that not every council member and staff member get along. When trying to get a council member on board with your proposal, lean on good conversations and explicit support if possible. From the electeds and staff you know the council member in question gets along with. If they ask about anyone's thoughts or opinions, always tell the truth, even if it's between electeds who you know don't get along. Remember that you can save face in the truth in a way you simply can't if you lie. And as much as possible, help staff and electeds to see the way to implement your vision. Make it as explicit as possible. We can use this funding to pay for the first phase of improvements at this intersection. In this example, you show the decision makers what funds they can use, demonstrate it as an incremental step, and make it part of the broader vision to improve the intersection in question. Whether working with an elected official or a staff member, always remember to keep a paper trail. So with doing this, request something via letter or email. Letter or email is fine to request, though it's important to state the obvious here. Email is likely to get the faster response. Some folks may prefer to do snail mail, and that's okay. The main thing to keep in mind is that you need to have something in writing for your correspondence with an official, especially if that correspondence involves questions or a specific request. More often than not, it will take several letters or emails before you get a formal response from the official you're corresponding with. If you need to send a reminder or follow-up message on a specific matter, be sure to refer to the last message you sent by date. It's also helpful to give a brief synopsis of what came from that last round of correspondence. And finally, the point of all of this is to make it easier to hold electeds and staff accountable to their work. Much like policies and plans have benchmarks you can use to hold government entities accountable in general, so too does written correspondence allow you to hold individuals accountable as well. Even if they ultimately don't do what you ask, you still have a record of what was discussed and the reasoning for the decision they made. Especially from an active transportation standpoint, it can be especially useful to create opportunities for staff and electeds to see circumstances from a pedestrian or cyclist perspective. The built environment looks and feels very different on foot or bike compared to the inside of a car. If you're able to organize such an event, be sure to do the following. First, taking pictures. This can help to convey the circumstances at hand to a wider audience, especially for people who aren't able to attend. Pictures can serve as a compelling portion of your request to fix something or build something new. The natural extension of this is to use social media. Be careful if you do this and always try to strike a diplomatic tone in what you say to caption those photos. As much as possible, couch your criticism in the system and give the elected or staff the opportunity to fix that system. It's also important with these in-person interactions to include a critical element, people. Especially if it's a street or intersection in your neighborhood, invite your neighbors to come and attend and share your insights. If it's near a school, invite the staff or electeds to observe arrival or dismissal of students. Be sure to speak with folks beforehand so they understand the purpose of the interaction. It doesn't mean everyone has to say the exact same thing. It means showing a side of the built environment that staff and electeds can't see by driving alone. These activities like these are not only meant to challenge prevailing narratives, they're also meant to spur leaders to action. That's why it's important to tie in-person experiences and interactions back to specific plans and policies. Shock the conscience with what you show, but then direct that conscience to a tangible action. We showed this to you because we want you to enact this plan, which includes guidance on how to make this area safer for people to walk, roll, or bike. If you're doing all of the work to build a strong rapport with electeds and staff, it may also be good to broaden that outreach to candidates for those offices as well. This applies primarily to electeds, but there are lessons here which can be applied to executive level staff like a city administrator if that individual will be chosen by electeds at a later time. The first element to keep in mind when reaching out to candidates is to do so early, even though early will vary depending on the community. Typically, you want to wait until after candidates have officially filed so you know who's actually on the ballot in the race for a given seat. You also want to try to reach out before campaign season becomes too busy and they're unreachable. On the back end, 2 to 3 months before an election can typically be a good moment to reach out. Second, candidates are running to represent a place. And so it is to your advantage if you can speak about your issues in the context of a candidate's potential jurisdiction. While this can include high-level elements like community-wide plans or policies, what would be more valuable is what you can tell them about what's happening in their neck of the woods. Are there streets which need road diets? Are there neighborhoods which could use more sidewalks? Is there a safe route for children to walk or bike to the area elementary school? The bottom line here is that you're working to build a rapport with the potential staff or elected as much as you are with current staff or electeds. In doing so, the idea is to present yourself as someone who can help to inform their deliberations about active transportation if they make it into the position that they're running for. So, while this is the last advocacy training of 2022, you can still catch up on our earlier training sessions on YouTube. These include AT 101, which covers the basics of speaking up for better walking and biking. AT 102, which explores how to become a better public speaker and how to prepare for public meetings. And finally, AT 103, which dives into how to build a winning coalition. With that, I want to thank you again for taking the time to listen. And now we will go to questions.